Hello, my name is Belle Reid, and I'm an experimental musician and sound designer who works primarily with trumpet, modular synthesizers, and other electronic instruments. Sonically, I'm really fascinated by the more unusual, chaotic, and noisy corners of the sound and music world. I love to work with complex textures and gestures in my music, and I really love any opportunity in which I can be surprised by my instruments and feel like I'm discovering something new. One of the reasons why I love working with modular synthesizers in particular is because of the interactive, co-creative possibilities that they can open up for improvisation and real-time exploration. So when the folks at Bella asked if I would be interested in checking out their interactive touch control module Gliss, I was definitely eager to spend some time with it and see what I would discover. The Gliss module features a touch controller strip that allows you to interact with your modular synth by drawing shapes and gestures. It can be used as an LFO, an envelope generator, a capacitive keyboard, a slider, but the way that I've personally really been enjoying exploring it the most is actually as a non-linear waveshaper. So when you're in waveshaper mode on Gliss, you can record a physical gesture into the module, and then you can use that gesture to perform wave shaping on an oscillator. So for example, I can start by recording a gesture here, and what I'm actually doing is defining what's called a transfer function by capturing this physical gesture into a buffer. So the information about the motion that I just made on Gliss is stored in a buffer. And then I can run a signal into the CV input on Gliss to scan through the buffer that I just created. If I use a linear ramp wave, I'll be scanning the buffer from the beginning to the end, over and over again. And that means that the shape I drew essentially becomes the waveform that we hear. But what's really interesting about this technique is that the buffer doesn't need to be scanned linearly, nor do we need to scan the entire contents of the buffer. So by changing the waveform we're using to scan the buffer, we will end up with a different resulting wave shape on the output. So for example, I will scrub the buffer with a sine wave instead. And now we're scanning the buffer forwards and then reversing backwards through it. If we change the amplitude of the signal that we're using to scrub the buffer, we will only scrub a portion of the buffer. So full-scale signals from -5 volts to 5 volts will scrub all the way from the beginning to the end. But something that's, say, only -1 volt to 1 volt will only scan a much smaller window. So you can get to some really, really interesting sonic results by modulating the amplitude of the signal that is scanning the buffer. So what I'm going to do is run the sine wave that we were using to scan the buffer into a VCA first. And then out from the VCA into Gliss. And I'm going to use an envelope to scan, or rather to change the amplitude of the sine wave. And then, of course, as you could see, we're able to arbitrarily change the transfer function on Gliss itself by drawing something new, even while we have other things going on. So it's also worth noting that this kind of nonlinear distortion doesn't just apply to audio rate signals. You could try these exact same techniques using slow-moving control voltages to scrub through the buffer. And then you'd end up with some really, really interesting and dynamic control voltages that you could apply to any parameter you want to modulate within your patch. I really, really enjoy working with Gliss in this way because while you can be super precise about the transfer functions that you're drawing, it's also super interesting to just let things be a little bit more intuitive and exploratory. In my opinion, it's really fun to just freely draw and input gestures and then get to hear the results of those actions in real time transferred onto an oscillator, waveshape, or control voltage source. All right, so I hope this was helpful and gave you some ideas to explore on your own. Special thanks once again to the kind folks at Bella for sending me a Gliss to check out and for creating this really inspiring module. I'm personally really looking forward to continuing to explore it more in the future and continuing to discover more ways that I can use it in my own music.